Hello, and today we're going to continue to look at the life of Solomon, which we find in 1 Kings in the Old Testament. And don't forget, there are notes that accompany this video, and if you don't have the notes, you can obtain them from prayer@rideelim.org. So that's the email address. So we've looked at the life of Solomon and at how he wrote 3 books of the Bible, 2 of which we have looked at already. So that's the Song of Songs, the book of Proverbs, and now we're coming on to look at the book of Ecclesiastes. And these 3 books were written at different stages in his life. So the first book, Song of Songs, was written when he was a young man. The second book, Proverbs, was when he was in his middle age. And then the last book, Ecclesiastes, was when he was an old man looking back on his life with regrets. So when reading the book of Ecclesiastes, sometimes people think, why on earth is this book in the Bible? Because it seems to say in places things that we don't find in other parts of the Bible, or more particularly contradicts things that are in other parts of the Bible. So why is it there? Well, what we have to do is to understand who wrote it, why he wrote it, and the context in which he wrote it. So Solomon was a man who started life well, and in his early days, he was walking closely with God. As he went through his life, he backslid. And the primary reason for his backsliding was he did what God told him not to do, and that was to marry women from other religions who then proceeded to pressure him into providing shrines and idols for them to worship. And so his heart was moved away from the true God, the Bible tells us. So by doing what God told him not to do, he suffered the consequences of what would happen, that God said would happen if you do it. So he ended up then in the wilderness, spiritually in the wilderness. And so for a period of his life, he went through the spiritual wilderness where he was away from God. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes is a book that he wrote at the end of that wilderness period. And he's looking back over his life and explaining how he tried to find satisfaction in life. And it's a very relevant book for today because all the things he talks about are right up to date in the 21st century. So although it was written 3,000 years ago, human nature never changes. And so it's as relevant today as it has ever been. And so the book of Ecclesiastes then is written by Solomon, although his name is not attached to it. He is the preacher referred to in the book of Ecclesiastes. And so it's like a sermon or an essay that he's written that chronicles the different phases in his life where he was looking for satisfaction. So it's written, we could say, from a human secular point of view. So somebody who's not walking with God, this is who he's writing. So at the time he's going through these experiences, he's not walking close with God. And so that's why it's so relevant for today, because his experiences are exactly the same experiences that people have today. And so he starts off the book by saying, vanity of vanities, or meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And of course, that is the situation of somebody who doesn't know God. What is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of life? There is no meaning, there is no purpose to life if you don't have God in your life. And so the book then traces his journey until it gets to the end. So when we get to the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, he comes to the conclusion that the only meaning in life is found when somebody is in relationship with God. So it's a very helpful book to be familiar with because the experiences that he went through are just as relevant to today. And he was a man who had everything. So he had great wealth, he had position, he had power. He was an international superstar because people came from other countries just to sit down and watch him or to listen to him, to learn from him. He had wealth beyond measure. So he had everything that the world could bring. So that's why it's a very relevant book. A man who has experienced everything the world can give you. And yet, with all these experiences that people try to find satisfaction in life, he's tried it all and said it doesn't work. So let's start to go through this book then. Chapter 1. It starts with a very modern, secular outlook. So he starts by saying, in his backslidden state, he looks at the world and it seems to be in a closed system. Nature's in a locked system. It goes on and on, day after day. It just repeats the same thing. And, humankind is trapped in this cycle of events. History seems to be going nowhere. Well, this is exactly the viewpoint of the secular mind that believes in evolution. The evolutionist says there's no God. We're not even going to contemplate God. We're just going to look at everything in the universe and in the earth, which we regard as a closed system. There's nothing outside of what we can see and experience. So that's the same. And also, history seems to have no purpose if you believe in the theory of evolution. Whereas the Bible, of course, both these things are has a wholly different viewpoint. The natural world and universe is not all there is. There is a spirit world. There is a God. These things are more real than the real world in many ways. And history is not going nowhere. It has a definite purpose. God is guiding history, and it is all about Jesus, and it culminates in the second coming of Jesus and eventually the creation of the new heavens and the new earth that the Bible speaks of, and life for eternity. So the viewpoint is very relevant for the modern day. He keeps using this expression "under the sun," which simply means the physical world. So everything, the physical world where a person's thoughts are focused only in the physical world, secular world, and not in the heavenly and the spiritual. So the cry of the unspiritual person: life seems to be meaningless. What is the point of life? So through this essay then that he writes, he looks at various areas and topics where he's searched for the meaning of life. So he starts with the place that I guess he would know best, and that is through philosophy and the study of human wisdom. And of course, he was endowed with a great deal of wisdom. And we have to remember that when we look at the life of Solomon and to understand his life, that he asked for and he was given by God a particular kind of wisdom. That is the wisdom to be able to govern. So it was the wisdom for earthly affairs, for political affairs, for running the country. Now that wisdom was also extended to natural history. So he was able to write books of natural history, and also to songs and proverbs that he was able to write. So he had this great measure of wisdom for worldly governance, which is a very good thing, to be able to govern well, plus those other things that I mentioned. But it did not extend to spiritual wisdom, as is evident from his life. So in spiritual matters, he acted with foolishness in some areas. So as he goes through the various experiences that he's trying to find the meaning of life, he comes to the conclusion that merely being wise, worldly wisdom, and human philosophy does not bring satisfaction. So, and the Bible tells us, 1 Corinthians 1, 20, 21, wisdom without God is foolishness. So far as God is concerned, the wisest of wise in worldly wisdom are fools. It is the fool that says there is no God, rejects God. So he doesn't find satisfaction in wisdom and philosophy. So chapter 2, he tries other areas of satisfaction, which are very relevant for today, because these are the kind of areas that people today are looking for who don't know God. So he says, the first thing I tried was getting drunk, wine, the abuse of alcohol. So I went to parties, had a great time, but I discovered that actually the abuse of alcohol did not bring a satisfaction to life. I tried it, didn't work. So he said, I then tried something else. And he was a man who had the ability to create all kinds of buildings and parks and cities, and he could authorize the building of many things, which he did. So to begin with, he built the temple, which was a very good thing. He spent a lot of time building his palace, and then he went on to build all these other monuments and other great things through the country. And he was able to look at those things and say, well, I was responsible for all those being built. But at the end of it, he said, although I invested all my time in all these great building works, working to do these, it did not bring me satisfaction of life. So work in itself and achieving things did not bring him satisfaction. So he went on then to look at his possessions. Now, he was a man who had vast wealth. So part of his wealth included annually 666 talents of gold. Now, a talent was a large sum, a large weight of money. And that was just part of his income. So he had vast wealth. He could buy anything he wanted. He just had the wealth to do it. He could acquire possessions. And yet at the end of all that he had, he could look round and say, I've got all this wealth. He said, it did not bring me the satisfaction, the meaning to life that I was looking for. So then he said, well, let me try sensual pleasure. So he had a harem of hundreds of women. And he thought, well, maybe that's the area I can find satisfaction in life. But at the end of the day, he said, neither that brought me meaning or satisfaction to life. Now, these are all things that you'll find people doing today. Drunkenness, parties, working all hours to get satisfaction, acquiring possessions, sexual immorality. But he said, I've been there, done it, and didn't bring me satisfaction. So he moves on then in continuing through chapter 12, saying thus far he hadn't found any meaning, purpose to life. And he says, well, the wise man dies in exactly the same way that the fool dies. So what's the point of being a wise person if your end is exactly the same? This is his secular thinking, worldly mind thinking. And if you spend a lot of energy working to acquire all these possessions, when you die, it goes to somebody else anyway. So what's the point of that? So he's still in this place where he's saying, well, what's the point of all these things? It doesn't bring satisfaction. But now towards the end of chapter 2, he's beginning to look at the significance of having God in a person's life. And then chapters 3 and 4, he's continuing through general observation, and he's observing things that people observe today. So he says it's clear from observing nature, just looking at the nature round about, that there is a set order and pattern to everything. There is a design, there is a creator behind creation, and everything seems to run very smoothly. All the workings of life, the way the nature all works together. And he says clearly creation is provided for human beings to enjoy what the earth provides, what's here on earth. And when we come to chapter 3, Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Now, this is an interesting chapter. It's the early verses are well known, where it begins with these words: "There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the sun, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot," and so it goes on. And I remember back in the 60s, I think it was, there was a very popular song, a song that did very well in the charts, that where the lyrics were taken from these verses, just plucked straight out of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and it did very well as a record. But there's as we go on through chapter 3, there's a very profound verse that we find in chapter 3, verse 11. If I can just go back to start verse 11, it says this: "He," that's God, "has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end." This is very profound, because what it's saying is that God has placed something in the heart of every individual. Now, it doesn't matter whether you've got the most advanced civilizations down through history up to today, or whether you go to the remotest parts of jungles where there are tribes that are cut off from civilization. It doesn't matter who they are. You'll find exactly the same thing, that in every person's heart there is this instinctive knowledge that there is more to life than what we have, that there is more beyond life. There is something supernatural beyond life. Now, that's an instinctive knowledge that God has put in the heart of every individual. And of course, people have different ideas of what it may be. Different religions spring from that. But it's put there by God, and the Bible does tell us that God has said, "If you search for me, you'll find me." So that instinctive knowledge within our heart, coupled with the creation round about us that speaks of a creator God, is God wanting every human being to search for him. Psalm 19, verses 1 to 4, and Romans chapter 1, verse 20, talks about the knowledge of God through creation. So the heavens declare the glory of God, and the psalm goes on to say that without speaking, without words, nature is speaking to people, saying, "Look, there is a God that brought all this into being." And in Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul says that creation itself declares there is a creator. And he goes on to say that everybody who says there is no God is not doing so because they don't know there's a God, but they're looking at creation and saying, despite the fact that I see the evidence of a creator all around me, I'm going to make a deliberate choice not to believe him. So Paul talks about people suppressing knowledge of the truth. It's a deliberate choice to say, I don't believe there's a God, even though all around me, creation tells me there is. And Paul says, for that reason, nobody is without excuse. Nobody can stand before God and say, well, I didn't know you existed. God will say, look, creation is screaming at everybody of a creator. So he goes on then in chapter 3 through into the beginning of chapter 4. He's observing things in nature, things that we see all around us even today. So he talks then about the injustice in human society, chapter 3, verse 16. Well, we know there is injustice in society, and we know the reason for it, and the reason is sin. Sin in people's hearts is why they act in a sinful way. But he's still in this, he still hasn't moved yet to the position where he's fully understanding the importance of being in a relationship fully with God on a day-to-day basis. So he's still thinking like a secular person, a worldly person. And he's saying, well, if you look at human beings, if you look at animals, they both have the same ending. They both die. So what's the point? Well, of course, that's what the secular evolutionists will say, you know. And if you're an evolutionist, what is the point of life? It has no meaning. They say we're like the animals. We're not, of course, because we're created special as human beings in God's image. But it's the same mindset. So he talks about the oppression that brings grief in society and wonders whether, is it better to be dead than be alive as a consequence? Well, we know it's sin that causes that. And continuing through chapter 4, he talks about human nature where people strive to be better than other people. So strive to achieve more, strive to gain more. And he says that's basically just caused by pride. But he's saying it brings no satisfaction in just trying to outdo other people. It brings no meaning to life, even though it seems to be ingrained in human nature to many a degree. He's beginning to move in the right direction when he says, well, perhaps the best thing is not just to work for yourself, but to work for others, to benefit other people in life. And there's a verse in chapter 4, verse 12, that is often quoted in marriages, where he says, and the context, I guess, is people helping one another, helping others. So he goes on, it says, though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. And that verse, of course, is often used in the context of marriage, 3 strands, husband, wife, Jesus in the middle, and that union is not then easily broken. Right, so we move on then into towards the end of chapter 14, and now he talks about popularity. Now, as I said, he was a man who was internationally famous, so he knew what popularity was all the time. From the age of as a teenager, he was a teenager when he came to the throne, and as a teenager, he gained that wisdom that God gave him. That enabled people to be amazed at his understanding. When he first demonstrated it, when 2 women brought a baby and they each claimed it as their own, saying that the other mother's child had died, in his wisdom, he said, well, let's bring a sword, cut it in half, give you half each, that would be fair. And immediately the mother said, no, don't kill it, give it to her. And the psychology behind it, he realized immediately that was the mother. So he was hugely popular, famous. And of course, today, that's what so many people want, isn't it? And in the age of social media, you can make a video in your back room and reach the world. Many people hoping to be famous as a result. Well, here's one who knew what it was to be famous all his life. But he said, you know what? Fame doesn't bring satisfaction. It doesn't bring meaning to life. Because he said, you may be popular today, but who knows about tomorrow? You may be rejected by people tomorrow. And that's true, of course, isn't it? Fame is fleeting. So fame, he said, is not the answer. Then he moves on then into chapters 5 and 6. And he's observing how should we live our lives then? So he's starting to move towards the right goal. And he's thinking about living a life that sort of outworks religious practices. And he says, well, I think it's prudent to observe correct practices and also to fear God. Now that's spot on, isn't it? The Bible says that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And the fear there is not a fear of punishment, but when somebody has reverence, a reverent fear that respects God and doesn't want to disobey God. And so that we fear to sin, but recognizing his holiness and greatness. We do sin, but we strive not to. That's the fear of God. And he says that's a good thing. And on the other hand, he says, setting your heart on acquiring things, the acquisition of wealth, you'll never acquire enough to be satisfied. You get to a certain level, you think, wow, that's good. Actually, I could do with a bit more. When you reach that, I could do with more. And he says that if your motivation is to acquire things and acquire wealth, you'll never be satisfied because you never get quite enough. You always think, I just need a bit more. he was a man then in a position to experience that. And so he says, well, it's probably a good thing to accept the position in life that God's placed you in without striving. Now, it's a good thing to be ambitious, and it's a good thing to want to better ourselves, but it's talking here about the striving. That's the bad thing. Jesus talks about this in Matthew 6:33 and 34. And so does Paul in Philippians chapter 4. And I think there's a lovely passage in Philippians chapter 4 where I'll just read now, that Paul is writing to the Philippians. Now, the Philippian church had sent money and provisions for Paul, who was under arrest. He was in prison. And so he writes his letter to them to thank them for the gifts that they've sent them, basically, and for the man that they sent with it to help him. But he says something very interesting about this particular topic in Philippians 4, verse 11. He says, I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I've learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. Or in another version, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now that's interesting because Paul says, I know what it is. I've experienced in my life. I've had times of plenty, and I've enjoyed that time. But equally, there have been times when I've had very little. But I've learned the secret of being content, that whether I have lots or little, that to be content in that situation. And that verse that is well known, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, is actually in that context, which is the context of finance and having very little. So he's saying, even if I've got very little, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's what Solomon is saying there. Wealth in itself is no guarantee of satisfaction of life. Owning things without happiness is worse, he says, than a child who dies at birth, because neither experiences happiness. The person who lives a long time with wealth but's not happy, or the child that dies at birth and in his lifetime doesn't have the opportunity to be happy. So only that the destiny of people can only be governed by one who is greater and higher than human beings, who alone knows the meaning to life and can give satisfaction. So he's moving in the right direction. So chapter 7 now, he's again observing, and he's talking about living an upright life. And he says wisdom is to avoid all extremes, he believes. Now, that's often the case. Often truth lies not in extremes, but in the middle somewhere. And also he says it's a wise thing to live in remembrance that one day we will die. So in other words, we're going to stand before God. But he says maintaining a good character is better than just living for immediate pleasures. Pursuing honesty and patience and wisdom may lead to satisfaction. But in themselves, these are not the full answer. Living an upright life, a righteous life, he says, is good, but there are other issues in life. For example, that the righteous people still perish, and the wicked still prosper. Now, of course, that's a theme that was taken up in the book of Job, where Job wrestled with that exactly the same problem, that the righteous can suffer, and the wicked can prosper in this life. And so Solomon points out the same thing. He also says that when it comes to living an upright life, the best of people are still sinners. Now, we know that no matter how hard a person strives to be good and upright, sin mars every individual. And also he says that even the most upright of people, there'll be others who speak against them. Now, I think that's quite true, that when somebody seeks to walk the walk of God sincerely, they will have their critics. People don't like those who seek to emulate and follow the Lord. So he concludes that it's a good thing to live an upright life, but the problem is that no one truly lives an upright life, and God concludes the same thing. Our righteousness comes from Christ, not from our own endeavours, though it is a good thing to live in the ways of the Lord. Moving on into chapter 8, he says, continuing the same theme, that living an upright life brings its benefits, but again, it doesn't avoid the fact that the righteous can still suffer and the wicked prosper. It's wiser and more sensible, he says, and expedient to live a moral and upright life and to be law-abiding than it is to be the opposite. Because a law-abiding person, he says, is less likely to have trouble. Well, we see a similar reference in to both Paul's letters and Peter's. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 to 7, 1 Peter 2, 13 to 17, both Peter and Paul say the same thing. And what they say is that for believers, God expects us to be law-abiding, upright citizens, model citizens. Now, they were both writing at a time when the ultimate authority in the Roman world was Emperor Nero, who was a very unpleasant character. But the principle is that law is given by God, or the lawgivers are given by God. Now, they're imperfect people, and often we may not like their laws, but we are told to live by them, with one exception. And one exception is where we see Peter and John, where they were commanded by the authorities not to preach in the name of Jesus, not to preach Jesus anymore. And they said, well, God's told us to preach Jesus. You're telling us not to. Who do we obey? Do we obey you or do we obey God? We have to obey God. And so the principle there is that we uphold the law, we live by the law, unless it is directly contrary to what God says. So if it contradicts God's law, then we follow God's law, not the human law that contradicts it. And also, Solomon says that it's a good idea to live an upright life because we don't know the day of our death, and suddenly we'll be ushered into the presence of God. So it's good to be in the right position when that happens. Although there may be benefits in wickedness, sin may bring its own pleasures. In the long term, he says, he's come to understand the one who fears God is better off. And he concludes that the anomalies in life, the righteous suffering, the wicked prospering in life, can't fully be understood at this time. We know, of course, that God knows the whole thing. So he concludes that a person should enjoy the life that God has given them in an upright way. And so divine judgment will come to each person eventually. So as he progresses in his thoughts, he comes more and more to see, he's moving to the position where we really need the presence of God in our life if we want to know the meaning and satisfaction in life. So as we come to chapter 9, we have a summary of his thoughts. And it's this. First of all people, he concludes, are in God's hands. Acts chapter 17, verse 28, we live and move and have our being in him, Paul tells us. Secondly, we share a common destiny, namely that we all die. Hebrews 9:27, it is appointed unto a person once to die and then the judgment. Thirdly, he says, all men's hearts are evil. Jeremiah 17:9, God says exactly the same thing, that every person's heart is evil. Only God can change a person's heart through Christ. And then he says that no one knows the hour when his end will come. So he's concluding wisdom is better than strength, and the effects of a person's sinfulness can be widespread. So in other words, a person who sins doesn't just affect themselves, but it affects other people negatively. So we can look at the example in Joshua chapter 7, where Achan sinned by stealing things from what was to be set apart from God, and the repercussions of his personal sin spread out through the whole community. So Solomon is beginning to conclude then that the highest good available to a person is to enjoy this present life wisely and gratefully. So that has some aspects of truth in full remembrance, as he later come to say, of the life to come and faith with God. So we're moving towards the end of the book now. Chapter 10, his thoughts about wisdom and foolishness he expressed in Proverbs. So a small amount of foolishness, so one or two foolish words or actions can spoil a person's reputation. So a person may be wise, have integrity, but if they say something stupid or do something stupid, it can affect widely, nullify everything that's gone before. Well, I suppose that was true of Solomon himself. He's speaking from experience. The position, he goes on to say, the position a person may come to occupy in life is not in itself an indication of how wise he is. So a person can be a very wise person, but be in a very lowly position. A person can be a complete fool, yet somehow occupies a high position through whatever circumstance. And so a wise person is someone who knows the wisdom of God, not moving in the wisdom of human beings only. So he concludes, no fool can bring himself any benefit. He says, like a snake charmer who's bitten by his own snake. So his own foolishness will destroy him. And Psalm 53 verse 1, the greatest foolishness of a person is to say there is no God. The fool has said in his heart there is no God. That's the greatest foolishness a person can commit. So in chapter 11 then he continues to express his thoughts. Since the future can't be known, he says, we must cooperate sensibly with the natural laws that we know round about us. And recognition of the uncertainty of the future makes the opportunities for the present all the more important. So we see that in the New Testament as well, that says, make the most of your opportunities now. We don't know what tomorrow holds, but make the most of the opportunities now. So for the Christian then, we should live as though we're going to live a very, very long time, or plan rather as though we're going to live a very, very long time, but live as though today's our last day. That's the way we should do that. We see that in the New Testament as well. So as we come towards the end of chapter 11 and into chapter 12, he comes to his conclusion. So he's been through all these experiences in life. He's explained all the things that he was able to do, and none of them brought satisfaction. And he, of all people, had the opportunity to do all these things. Now he's coming to the conclusion, as he's been in these wilderness years away from God, and the sorrow in his heart that it's brought and the meaninglessness it's brought, though he had everything that the world could give. He comes to the conclusion, remember your Creator while you are young. So as a young person, enjoy the advantages of youth while you still have your youth, but life must always be lived in remembrance that everything that we do, God is watching and will be brought into judgment by God. So Matthew 12, 36 and 37, Jesus speaks about that also. So for those who are following the Lord, that's not a bad thing. We hope that as we stand before the Lord, we'll hear those words, well done, good and faithful servant, because God is watching what we do. And also we know as believers that we can stand before God and say, we know we're justified by the blood of Jesus. So we're not judged for our sin. We are assessed for our faithfulness as believers in the circumstances that we find our lives. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 10, his advice to banish anxiety there. And so he's concluded that the greatest good a person can find in life is to know and remember God from his or her youth all the way through to growing old, and to remember God before death, before it's too late. And he talks very poetically about death here. He talks about the silver cord being severed, the silver cord of life, the golden bowl being broken, golden bowl of life, the pitcher being shattered, again referring to life, the wheel broken at the well, wheel of life, the dust of the body. Now here's a very interesting verse, which we find in the Bible only in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, where he's talking about death and what happens at death, and he mentions in chapter 12, verse 7. So he's gone through these poetic ways of dying, wheel of life broken and so on. And he says, and the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. So the dust, of course, being the body, returning to the ground, the spirit returning to God. Now we have a body, soul, and a spirit, and we know what our body is. Our soul is that part of us that never dies. So it's the same shape as our body, but when we die, our soul separates from our body. It contains our mind, our will, our thoughts, our emotions, and it's the real us. And that soul will one day be reclothed for the believer with a new resurrection body. The spirit is that part of us that returns, that makes us conscious of God. So when we're dead in our trespasses and sins, Paul tells us in Ephesians chapter 2, we don't know God, because God is spirit. We can only know God through our spirit. And this is a very interesting verse, because it's the only verse I'm aware of in the Bible that talks about what happens to the spirit as opposed to the body and the soul. The spirit returns to God who gave it. And so he's now thinking spiritually. So he concludes his sermon or his essay by restating the theme that he started with. Everything is meaningless if you don't have a personal relationship with God. So after his experiences and seeking the true God for happiness and satisfaction in life, he comes to the conclusion, and it's found in this: to fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man, he says. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether good or evil. So the message of the book, we can sum up as this. First of all, it shows, it's seen through the eyes of the world. So when somebody is unspiritual, this is the way they are looking and thinking. That's why we come across things in the book of Ecclesiastes that we say, well, that doesn't fit in with the rest of the Bible. It's because it's an unspiritual person thinking and saying those things. And it's part of the process of coming to the conclusion that we put those, we reject those ways of trying to find meaning to life or satisfaction, and we come to the conclusion that it's God, our relationship with God, where we find it. Without God, life has no meaning, it has no purpose. Secondly, life can be filled with many activities, good or bad, but no activity can fill the void in a person's life if God's not with them in their life. So a person will always remain unsatisfied until he or she knows their creator. The world cannot satisfy what only God can satisfy. Thirdly, the earlier in age that a person comes to know God, the more fulfilled their life will be, because it will be filled with meaning and purpose. We will walk in God's destiny. Fourthly, not everything in life can be understood. There are things that happen that we don't understand, things that happen to the righteous or the wicked prospering. We don't understand those things. But the certainty of life after death and the meeting with our Creator in judgment certainly can be known. Fifthly, when reading the book, then the life of its author Solomon should be borne in mind. A man who was in a backslidden state and had wandered away from God, but now was finding his way back to a relationship with God. And probably written right at the end of his life, he looks back regretting many of the things that he'd done. Sixthly, the book shows how unhappiness and meaninglessness comes when a person, first of all, only lives to get instead of to give, because unhappiness comes through such selfishness. Secondly, living a life apart from God, rather than a life controlled by God, which alone can bring true joy. And thirdly, death at the end of life is not the end, but it's the beginning of the next phase of eternity. So a life that's lived only for this world is the vanity of vanities or meaningless. So John 10:10, Jesus came that we might have life and have it in abundance. Abundant life we find only in Jesus. And that includes eternal life. So not merely living forever, because all people will live forever. Just depends where you live, with God in heaven or separated from God. But it means eternal life includes all the blessings that come through Jesus. And that he provides the answer to all our doubts, strivings, raised by the problems that the writer of Ecclesiastes raises as he goes through the book. So, as I say, it's a very pertinent book, very relevant for today. And all the issues there, though 3,000 years old, are all relevant to today's society. And the conclusion is exactly the same. You can't do it without a relationship with God through Jesus.